You glance down at your phone. There's nothing waiting for you. No new messages, no response. And suddenly your mind begins filling the quiet with worry, doubt, and endless questions. But what if the truth is that love doesn't always express itself through constant messaging? What if sometimes, when a man falls deeply for someone, he grows quieter? Not because his feelings are weakening, but because they're intensifying. The quiet that comes from men is frequently misunderstood. This happens because contemporary culture treats expression as proof of emotion. If something hasn't been spoken, written, or made immediately visible, people assume it doesn't exist. From a psychological standpoint, particularly through Carl Jung's understanding of the masculine psyche, quietness often represents internal activity rather than emotional absence. Many men are conditioned from their early years to process emotions internally. They learn to observe, to hold things within, and to manage their feelings privately before allowing them to surface. When love begins to develop, this pattern doesn't dissolve, it actually intensifies. For a man, falling in love isn't always a smooth emotional expansion. It can feel like a disruption to the identity he's carefully constructed. Jung described the ego as something that seeks stability and control. Love challenges both of these. If you've experienced this silence, write "patience" in the comments. It brings uncertainty, vulnerability, and emotional exposure, which the ego frequently experiences as threatening. When this happens, a man might not reach outward. He might turn inward instead. Silence becomes a psychological buffer. It's the space where the unconscious attempts to reorganize itself around a new emotional reality. This internal processing is rarely peaceful. Love activates fears that have little to do with the person he loves, and everything to do with unresolved material within himself. Fear of loss, fear of inadequacy, fear of dependency, fear of repeating past wounds. These fears don't announce themselves clearly. They operate beneath awareness. They create tension that the man may not yet understand. Because he doesn't have language for this internal shift, he retreats into silent observation. Not to escape the feeling, but to understand it without destabilizing his external life. Jung believed that what remains in the unconscious expresses itself indirectly. In this sense, silence isn't emptiness, it's content. The man is holding something significant without yet knowing how to express it. Words require clarity. Silence allows for ambiguity. And love, in its early stages, is often ambiguous even for the person experiencing it. He may feel that something important is happening, but he's uncertain about its implications. Speaking too soon feels dangerous. Acting impulsively feels irresponsible. So he waits internally. He listens to his own reactions, measures his emotional responses, and tests whether this feeling is temporary or transformative. Another reason silence emerges is that love threatens autonomy. For many men, independence is deeply tied to their sense of self-worth. Loving someone introduces emotional interdependence, which can feel like a loss of control if it hasn't yet been integrated into the psyche. Jung referred to this tension as part of the individuation process, the journey toward wholeness. Love forces a man to confront the parts of himself he's neglected, particularly emotional sensitivity and relational depth. Silence becomes a protective pause, while the psyche negotiates this expansion without collapsing underneath. Importantly, this form of silence isn't passive. There's internal reflection, rehearsal, and emotional monitoring happening. He replays interactions. He analyzes his reactions and notices how his priorities are shifting. He may not be messaging, but he's thinking. He may not be talking, but he's remembering. He may not be expressing longing directly, but his attention is quietly reorganizing itself around the person he loves. Jung emphasized that attention is psychic energy. Wherever attention goes, meaning follows. This is why silence shouldn't be judged in isolation. In Jungian psychology, behavior is observed in patterns, not moments. If silence coexists with consistency, awareness, and subtle care, it's generally a sign of internal depth rather than withdrawal. The man isn't emotionally absent, he's emotionally engaged. For you, which matters more, right? Action or words in the comments. He's allowing the feeling to settle into the internal structure before giving it external form. This process takes time, especially for those who were never taught to externalize emotions safely. The danger only appears when silence pairs with avoidance, inconsistency, or indifference. Jung never romanticized unconscious behavior. He believed awareness must eventually come. But before awareness comes incubation. Silence is love's incubation phase. It's where emotion is transformed into something stable enough to live in the external world, something that won't collapse under pressure. Something that can be sustained without betraying the self. When a man is falling in love, his behavior frequently reflects the internal struggle between desire and restraint, instinct and reflection. In the modern world, we tend to equate love with pursuit, constant messages, frequent attention, and visible declarations of affection. However, from a Jungian perspective, genuine love often manifests in restraint rather than outward display. This restraint isn't a lack of feeling. It's a careful negotiation between the conscious self and the unconscious impulses that love awakens. Jung taught that the human psyche seeks balance, and love can destabilize it by confronting long-standing patterns of control, independence, and self-protection. When a man restrains himself, he's often preserving the essence of what he feels, attempting to integrate a powerful emotion into the structure of his identity without losing the integrity of his ego. This restraint becomes especially pronounced when the man experiences fear alongside affection. Falling in love exposes vulnerability, which can feel threatening to a psyche conditioned to prioritize self-sufficiency. Jung described this process as confronting the anima, the inner feminine aspect of the male psyche that represents intuition, emotional depth, and relational sensitivity. Many men grow up suppressing this part, and love forces it to the surface. In this awakening, the psyche feels unbalanced. The intensity of emotion can overwhelm the rational ego, prompting withdrawal or silence. The restraint seen in his behavior is a psychological pause, a way of regulating and integrating emotions without acting impulsively or destructively. Restraint also reflects a deeper sense of responsibility toward the relationship itself. Men who are genuinely falling often unconsciously understand that emotions need to be cultivated carefully. They may choose silence over speaking, distance over impulsiveness, precisely because they realize that acting too early could harm both themselves and the object of their affection. Jung emphasized that actions arising from the unconscious, without conscious integration, can be harmful or chaotic. Therefore, a man's deliberate restraint is a manifestation of the unconscious mind's attempt to bring order to powerful emotions before expressing them externally. Moreover, this restraint often appears as a preference for subtlety in communication and action. He may think about you constantly, notice details others would overlook, and adjust his behavior to include you without stating it explicitly. If you're seeking this depth in relationships, write maturity in the comments. This internal attentiveness reflects a deep commitment to the relationship that transcends verbal expression. Jung believed that meaningful connections are often encoded in the unconscious patterns of attention and care, rather than direct expression. When a man restrains himself, he's often observing, internalizing, and planning. He's waiting until the emotions are consistent enough to express them responsibly. Restraint can also emerge from past experiences, wounds or fears of repeating relational patterns. Men who have experienced loss, betrayal, or emotional instability may approach love cautiously. Jungian psychology suggests that the unconscious carries these memories and archetypal patterns, influencing present behavior even if not fully understood. By restraining himself, the man is unconsciously protecting both his vulnerability and the potential relationship from the turbulence of unresolved past experiences. His silence isn't disinterest, it's a form of emotional self-regulation that preserves the potential for authentic connection. It's important to understand that this restraint isn't a passive state, it's an active process of internal reflection, calibration, and preparation. Even if he doesn't reach out frequently or demonstrate affection overtly, the psyche is engaged in a profound internal dialogue. He's measuring his feelings, considering the consequences of his actions, and monitoring the alignment between his desires and his principles. Jung argued that this internal work is essential for the formation of stable, mature love, a love grounded not in reactivity or superficiality, but in self-awareness and intentionality. This behavior challenges the cultural assumption that love must always be performative. From a Jungian perspective, Restraint is a sign of depth, maturity, and conscious integration. A man who exercises restraint is often doing so to reconcile powerful emotions with his internal sense of self. He's balancing instinct with reflection, desire with discipline, and feeling with responsibility. The third silent sign of a man's love lies in his actions, where presence becomes more important than performance. In Jung's framework, love isn't merely an emotion. It's a transformative process that organizes the psyche toward responsibility, awareness, and care. Words are often inadequate to express the depth of this transformation, particularly in men who are culturally or psychologically conditioned to restrain emotional expression. Therefore, the true manifestation of love frequently emerges in deeds rather than declarations. A man who doesn't message constantly, but consistently shows up in meaningful ways, is signaling his dedication and commitment through the language of action, rather than the fleeting symbols of conversation. This form of love is subtle, and often goes unnoticed because it doesn't demand immediate recognition. A man who loves quietly will attend to the rhythms of your life, notice what goes unsaid, perceive what's needed, and offer support in concrete but unobtrusive ways. Jung described these kinds of manifestations as the interplay of conscious and unconscious energies, where the unconscious channels the depth of feeling into behaviors that sustain the object of affection. This might include ensuring your comfort, responding to emotional shifts, or protecting your well-being without requiring acknowledgement. These actions are expressions of psychic energy directed outward. They demonstrate love as an integrating and sustaining force rather than a passing emotion. What distinguishes this behavior is that it's grounded in responsibility. Men often associate love with protection, stability, and reliability, so their care frequently manifests in observable outcomes rather than verbal reassurances. From Jung's perspective, the psyche seeks wholeness, and love is one of the most powerful forces for integration. When a man acts to preserve the harmony of someone he loves, he's extending his own internal development toward relational growth. His silence in conversation is compensated by consistency in action, creating a pattern of behavior that conveys commitment more powerfully than words alone. Another dimension of this silent expression is attentiveness to subtle cues. Jung emphasized that the unconscious communicates through symbols and patterns, and in human relationships, these patterns can take the form of observation and responsiveness. A man in love may not articulate his feelings because he's attuned to his partner's emotional and practical needs. He responds intuitively before being asked. This attentiveness is a profound signal of affection because it shows that his mind and heart are oriented toward you, even without explicit prompting. The absence of words doesn't mean the absence of care. It indicates a sophisticated interplay between perception, intention, and action that reflects unconscious depth. The manifestation of love through action, rather than speech, also reflects the individuation process. Jung proposed that true relational maturity occurs when individuals integrate the unconscious aspects of their psyches, including emotional sensitivity, empathy, and relational insight. For a man, love functions as the catalyst for this integration. The behaviors you observe, quietly checking in, helping without fanfare, being present in challenging situations, are external traces of a deep internal alignment. The psyche is organizing itself around the value of care, translating feelings into concrete actions that strengthen connection and trust. Additionally, these silent acts of love are often consistent over time, creating patterns that reveal intentionality. Jung understood that consistency reflects a deeper alignment between the conscious self and unconscious impulses. A man's reliability and presence in action, even in the absence of verbal or digital validation, is evidence that love has shifted from mere admiration to commitment and responsibility. This silent dedication isn't contingent on recognition or reward. It's a manifestation of an internal, moral, and emotional architecture that views another person's well-being as inseparable from the integrity of the self. Understanding this silent sign requires reframing cultural assumptions about love. Modern society equates emotional expression with textual validation, but Jungian psychology shows that the deepest forms of commitment often speak through actions that require observation, intuition, and emotional literacy. By attuning to these behaviors, you can distinguish love that is stable, nourishing, and enduring, where presence itself becomes the language of the heart, grounded in both conscious intention and unconscious depth. In the modern imagination, love has increasingly become associated with digital presence. Messages, replies, and online visibility are treated as emotional currency, creating the illusion that frequency equals depth. However, from Jung's perspective, this equation misunderstands the nature of true commitment. The psyche bonds not only with symbols, but with lived experience. Consistent presence in real life carries a psychological weight that digital attention cannot replicate, because it engages the body, the senses, and the unconscious in ways that screens never can. Carl Jung emphasized that the unconscious is formed through direct experience rather than abstraction. Physical presence allows the psyche to register safety, reliability, and emotional attunement at a level that words alone cannot reach. When a man shows up consistently in actual situations, when he listens without distraction, remembers your patterns, and remains available when life gets difficult, he's offering something far more intimate than text-based reassurances. This kind of presence communicates commitment through behavior rather than performance, which is why it often goes unnoticed in a culture trained to prioritize visible signals over grounded ones. A man who loves deeply may not feel compelled to constantly validate that love digitally, because his sense of connection is anchored elsewhere. His commitment is expressed through shared reality rather than symbolic exchange. Jung would argue that this kind of behavior reflects an integrated psyche, someone who doesn't seek validation through continuous external affirmation. Instead, the man invests his psychic energy in sustaining stability, predictability, and continuity in the relationship. Love becomes something embedded in routine, lived rather than proclaimed, rather than dramatized through language. This distinction is particularly important in understanding masculine expressions of care. Many men are socialized to equate love with responsibility rather than expression. They demonstrate commitment by showing up consistently, offering solutions, protection, or practical support. In Jungian terms, this reflects the grounding of emotional energy into action, where feeling is converted into structure. The man may not narrate his emotions, but he constructs a relational environment where those emotions can exist safely. By contrast, digital attention often operates at the ego level, immediately reactive and easily disrupted by anxiety or insecurity. Real-life presence requires patience, effort, and emotional regulation. It asks the man to remain engaged, even when the moment is uncomfortable, mundane, or challenging. Jung believed that maturity emerges with the capacity to endure rather than escape. A man who remains consistently present in actual situations, even without verbal validation, is demonstrating a form of love rooted in endurance rather than stimulation. Another Jungian layer to this dynamic lies in projection. While messaging allows people to reflect idealized versions of themselves and others, physical presence shatters illusion. A man who chooses real-life consistency over constant digital contact is often seeking authenticity over fantasy. He wants to know you beyond words, curated messages, and emotional performance. His love grows through observation, shared silence, and mutual reality. This kind of connection develops slowly, but it's far more resilient because it's based on reality rather than imagination. This doesn't mean communication isn't important, but Jung warned against mistaking the symbol for the essence. Words, messages, and emojis are symbols of connection, not the connection itself. When a man prioritizes being there when it matters, remembering what affects you, and aligning his actions with your well-being, he's communicating love in a language older than speech. The unconscious understands presence as safety. Repeated presence builds trust. Trust creates attachment. Attachment creates love that isn't dependent on constant reinforcement. When evaluating love, the psyche responds more powerfully to patterns than promises. A man who shows up reliably in your real life, remains emotionally available through action, and integrates you into the fabric of his daily existence is expressing something far deeper than transient digital engagement. Jung would see this as the psyche committing to relationship, not as an emotional impulse, but as a lived orientation toward another human being, where love is about alignment, continuity, and shared reality unfolding across time and circumstance, rather than expression. Protection, awareness, and silent concern are among the most instinctual expressions of masculine commitment, yet they often go unnoticed because they operate below the level of conscious performance. From Jung's perspective, these behaviors emerge from the deep layers of the psyche, where instinct, archetype, and emotion converge. When a man begins to love, something ancient within him activates, something older than language, older than modern courtship expectations. Love awakens the protective archetype, not as dominance or control, but as an orientation towards safeguarding what feels meaningful and vulnerable. This protection doesn't always look dramatic. It's subtle, often invisible to those who expect love to be loud. He becomes more aware of your surroundings, your emotional state, your safety, and your energy. He notices small shifts in your mood. He remembers what troubles you. He's attentive to factors that might affect your well-being. Even if he never names this concern directly, Jung believed that the unconscious expresses itself through attention and instinctive response long before it reaches conscious expression. In this sense, protection begins as awareness. You occupy space in his psyche, and that space naturally invites vigilance. Silent concern is particularly revealing because it doesn't seek recognition. A man operating from ego seeks appreciation. A man operating from instinct acts because he cannot help but act. His concern arises naturally, without calculation. He checks that you've arrived safely, not to earn validation, but because the thought appeared uninvited. He adjusts his behavior to avoid causing you stress. He holds back words that might wound rather than heal. These gestures are small, but Jung argued that small, consistent behaviors reveal the psyche's true orientation more accurately than grand declarations. This instinctual care is also tied to emotional regulation. When a man loves, he becomes more conscious of the impact of his actions. Jung described love as a force that brings unconscious material into awareness. A man whose feelings are developing may grow quieter, more thoughtful, more intentional. He doesn't want to disrupt the emotional balance of the connection. His silence isn't disconnection, it's attentiveness. He's learning where you're sensitive, where you're strong, and how to move through that emotional landscape without causing harm. Protection also manifests as boundary awareness. Contrary to popular belief, love doesn't always push toward closeness. Sometimes it creates respectful distance. When a man senses you're overwhelmed, he may pull back. Rather than demanding reassurance, he may offer space. Jungian psychology recognizes this as a sign of empathy rather than indifference. The psyche has recognized the other as separate, real, and deserving of respect. This recognition is essential for genuine love, which Jung distinguished from projection or possession. Another layer of silent concern emerges in how he responds to threats, not necessarily physical ones, but emotional or situational stressors. When something undermines your stability, he becomes alert. He may not confront it directly, but he remains present, observant, and ready. This readiness is an unconscious commitment. Jung would see this as the psyche reorganizing itself around the value of another person's well-being. In this sense, love isn't an emotion that comes and goes. It's a restructuring of priorities. What makes these signs difficult to recognize is their lack of drama. They don't announce themselves. They're woven into ordinary moments. Jung emphasized that the unconscious reveals itself through patterns, rather than declarations. If a man consistently demonstrates awareness, adjusts his behavior to preserve emotional balance, and carries silent concern without demanding anything in return, his psyche has already attributed significance to you. You matter enough to influence his instinctive responses. This form of love is often misunderstood because it doesn't align with cultural narratives that equate affection with verbal reassurance or constant contact. But Jungian psychology invites us to look deeper, to observe where psychic energy flows. A man who loves quietly directs his energy toward protection, not performance. He doesn't need to convince himself or others of his feelings. His concern exists whether it's acknowledged or not. These instincts develop slowly and strengthen over time, becoming more refined and attuned. The man grows increasingly sensitive to your internal state, more careful with his words, more consistent in his presence. His protection evolves from simple awareness to emotional stewardship, where your sense of security becomes intertwined with his sense of integrity, where caring for you feels inseparable from staying true to himself, where love is lived not in proclamation, but in the quiet vigilance of someone who has made an unconscious decision that you matter enough to protect, even in moments of distance, uncertainty, or silence, your well-being. In Jungian psychology, love is inseparable from the individuation process, the lifelong movement toward becoming a whole and integrated self. This makes love far more than an emotion or attachment. It becomes a psychological task. When a man begins to love, he's not only drawn toward another person, he's drawn toward parts of himself that have long remained unconscious. Love reveals the contradictions within him, where desire conflicts with fear, where intimacy challenges autonomy, and where emotional depth confronts long-standing defenses. This is why love often develops internally, long before it becomes visible or verbal. Jung believed that many men grow up primarily identifying with the ego, the rational, controlled, socially acceptable part of the psyche. Emotional vulnerability, intuition, and relational sensitivity are often pushed into the unconscious, forming what Jung called the shadow. When love emerges, it activates this suppressed inner world. The man doesn't just feel affection, he experiences internal disruption. The old structures that once defined him begin to feel inadequate. Silence often accompanies this phase because the psyche is undergoing reorganization. He's not avoiding love, he's integrating it. This integration requires time. Unintegrated love tends to be impulsive, unstable, or performative. Jung warned that emotions not brought into consciousness can act destructively. A man who values integrity may instinctively slow down when love appears. He doesn't want to express feelings he doesn't yet understand. He doesn't want to promise what he can't yet sustain. His silence is an ethical pause, a way of ensuring that what he offers is aligned not with who he was, but with who he's becoming. Love doesn't always announce itself through words, messages, or constant reassurance. Sometimes it moves quietly, shaping behavior, attention, and internal priorities long before it reaches language. When a man loves, especially from a place of psychological depth, his feelings may first appear as silence, restraint, presence, protection, and internal transformation. These aren't signs of emotional absence, they're signs of emotional seriousness. Love growing from the unconscious is careful. It doesn't rush to perform. It seeks to integrate, to stabilize, to become something that can endure rather than merely impress. Jung reminded us that the deepest truths of the psyche reveal themselves not through declarations, but through patterns. When you learn to observe consistency over communication, action over validation, and awareness over appearance, you begin to recognize love in its most mature form. A man who is whole doesn't give love lightly. He first allows it to reshape him, and when love finally speaks, it doesn't come as noise or urgency, but as clarity, solidity, and presence that no silence could ever contradict. If you've watched this video to the end, write awareness in the comments.